complete timeline
Before the
of
Vikings
Viking
became
Age,
legends,
from raid
they
to
were
reign,
survivors.
before the raids,
What kind of people could
before the
thrive in
legends,
such a brutal
before the
land?
world learned to
The
fear
sea was
sight
not their
of a
enemy,
dragon-headed
it
ship
was
on
their
the
future.
horizon. There was only ice,
The Aurora
stone,
guides
and
our
survival.
path. Aye, to the
Scandinavia
longhouse.
in the early centuries AD
The Vikings
was not a
believed
place
their
that
fate was
welcomed
controlled by
weakness.
gods. What
Winters
kind of
lasted
warriors
half
would
the
fight
year
without
and
fearing
killed without
death?
mercy.
I am
The
Odin,
mountains
the
were
All-Father.
steep and
I am for
unforgiving.
Thor, Doki
The
hot
soil,
cricket,
thin and
tricked.
rocky, gave back barely what was planted. Storms came without warning and swallowed men whole. And yet people
A
lived
revolutionary
and not
invention
just survived,
emerges.
but
Will
built
it
something
carry us
fierce
beyond the
and
edge?
beautiful.
The creation
Norse
of the
people
Viking
clustered in
longship.
small villages
The
along
horizon is no
fjords,
longer a
those
limit.
deep, narrow channels carved by ancient glaciers between towering cliff walls. They fished in waters that could turn lethal in minutes. They hunted in forests where wolves still ran in packs. They farmed every scrap of workable land they could find. Everything they had, they fought for, against the cold, against the sea, against starvation, against each other. A culture forged in hardship does not produce gentle people. It produces people who can endure anything, fear almost nothing, and see the world not as a place of safety, but as a challenge to be conquered. These were the people who would one day shake the entire world, and the sea was not their enemy. The sea was their future. To understand what the Vikings did, you must first understand what they believed. The Norse religion was not built around peace or mercy or quiet devotion. It was built around courage. The Vikings worshipped a family of gods as complicated, flawed, and powerful as any ancient mythology ever produced. Odin, the Allfather, ruled from his great hall Asgard, one-eyed and infinitely wise, having sacrificed his own eye for knowledge. He was the god of war, death, wisdom, and poetry all at once. Thor, his son, carried a hammer called Mjolnir and fought giants to protect both gods and men. Loki was the trickster, brilliant and dangerous, whose schemes created as many problems as they solved. But what truly set the Norse religion apart was its vision of death. Warriors who fell bravely in battle were carried to Valhalla, Odin's magnificent feasting hall, where they would fight and feast every day until the end of the world. Death in battle was not a tragedy, it was a reward. A Viking warrior who understood this did not fear dying. He feared dying badly, of illness, of old age, in his bed, without a sword in his hand. These beliefs did not merely shape Viking culture, they became fuel for everything that came next. Their gods demanded courage, and soon the world would witness it. The weapon that made the Vikings possible was not a sword or an axe, it was a ship. By the late 8th century, Norse shipbuilders had solved engineering problems that no other culture in Europe had cracked. Their longships were works of breathtaking genius, long, narrow, lightweight vessels built from overlapping planks of oak in a technique called clinker construction, which made the hull flexible enough to bend with ocean waves without breaking. A fully built longship could cross the open Atlantic Ocean and still be light enough to be carried overland between rivers. It could navigate the deep sea and row up a shallow river into the heart of a continent. It drew so little water that it could land directly on a beach, disgorging warriors without the need for a port or dock. A Viking crew of 60 men could drive such a ship at speeds that shocked every navy they encountered. Nothing in European waters could match it. The longship didn't just give the Vikings a way to travel, it gave them speed, surprise, and access to places no raiding force had ever reached before. Monasteries on remote islands, cities deep inland, coastlines that felt safely distant from any threat. All of it was suddenly reachable. All of it was suddenly vulnerable. The horizon was no longer a limit. June 8, 793 AD, the monks of Lindisfarne had no warning. Their island monastery sat off the northeast coast of England, isolated and peaceful, one of the holiest sites in all of Christendom. It had stood for over a century, a place of prayer, scholarship, and extraordinary wealth in the form of golden crosses, jeweled reliquaries, and priceless illuminated manuscripts. Then the ships came, dragon prows cutting through morning fog, men in iron helmets leaping from shallow hulls onto the beach before the monks could run. What followed was swift and savage. The monastery was ransacked. Monks were killed, captured for slavery, or driven into the freezing sea. The treasures accumulated over generations were loaded onto Viking ships and carried away. The English monk Alcuin, writing shortly after, described it as something from the end of the world, a horror so unexpected and so violent that he struggled to find words for it. A place so sacred, so remote, so seemingly protected by God himself, had been torn apart in a single morning. The shock rippled through every Christian kingdom in Europe. Who were these people? Where had they come from? And why had God allowed such a thing to happen? The Christian world had no answers. But the Vikings had barely begun. This was not an isolated attack. It was the beginning of an age. After Lindisfarne, the raids multiplied. Every summer, Viking fleets appeared on coastlines across Europe with the regularity of a deadly tide. Ireland was hit hard, its monasteries wealthy, its coasts accessible, its kingdoms too divided to mount an effective defense. Francia, the vast Frankish kingdom built by Charlemagne, found its river towns and cathedral cities exposed to longships that appeared without warning out of morning mist. England's coastal villages learned to watch the sea with terror. The Vikings were not yet an invading army. They were lightning, fast, selective, and disappearing before any organized defense could respond. They struck, they took, they vanished. Gold, silver, livestock, slaves, everything of value was loaded onto ships and carried north. The Norse word for this activity, Viking, meant something like to go raiding, and the men who did it saw it less as crime than as an extension of the hunting and fishing culture they had grown up in. The sea provided. You simply had to be strong enough to take it. Year after year, the raids grew bolder, larger fleets, deeper penetration inland, targets that would have seemed unthinkably audacious just a decade earlier. What had begun as summer raiding by small bands was becoming something more organized, more strategic, more dangerous. Gold was no longer enough. The Vikings were starting to think bigger. In 865 AD, something changed completely. A massive Viking force landed on the east coast of England. Not raiders, not summer pirates looking for easy plunder. An army, a real army, large enough to campaign across the entire country, supplied for years, commanded by experienced warriors. The Anglo-Saxons who encountered it called it the Great Heathen Army, and the name carried genuine terror. The force was led by men whose names the English would not forget. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba, commanders of ruthless strategic intelligence who had no intention of raiding and leaving. They intended to conquer. They marched north and took the city of York, the most important settlement in northern England, in a single savage assault in 866 AD. They renamed it Jorvik and made it their base. Then they turned south, systematically dismantling the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had defined England for centuries. Their campaign was brilliant, methodical, and merciless. These were not men who had come for gold trinkets. They had come for land, for power, for permanence. The political map of England, stable for generations, was being redrawn in blood and iron by men from the frozen north. The future of England hung in the balance. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell. Northumbria, the powerful northern kingdom that included York, collapsed first, its kings killed and its authority destroyed. East Anglia fell next. Its king Edmund refused to renounce his faith to save his life and was executed by the Vikings in 869 AD. He would later be declared a saint, martyred at the hands of men his people called pagans. Mercia, the great Midland kingdom that had once dominated central England, crumbled under the sustained pressure of Viking military campaigns. Its king fled, its armies dissolved. The Great Heathen Army moved across the English landscape with a confidence that suggested it considered the country already won. And from a purely military standpoint, it very nearly was. 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been broken in less than a decade. Viking settlers began arriving behind the armies, farmers, craftsmen, families, filling the land that warriors had cleared. Norse words began mixing with English. Norse place names appeared on the map. Norse customs took root in English soil. The transformation of England was underway, driven by force of arms and followed by waves of settlement. An entire civilization was being layered over another. It seemed unstoppable. It seemed complete. Only one kingdom remained, and it was on the edge of ruin. His name was Alfred, and in the winter of 878 AD, he was hiding in a swamp. Wessex, the last surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom, had nearly been destroyed by a sudden Viking assault led by a chief named Guthrum. Alfred's forces had been scattered. His court was in chaos. He was a hunted man in his own kingdom, sheltering in the marshes of Somerset, with a handful of loyal followers, while Viking forces occupied his lands and waited for him to surrender or starve. He did neither. Alfred used those desperate winter months to rebuild. He sent messengers to loyal nobles. He reorganized his military system, creating fortified towns called burhs across Wessex that could serve as defensive strongpoints. He raised a new army, and in the spring of 878 AD, he marched out of the swamp and met Guthrum's forces at the Battle of Edington. Alfred won, decisively, completely, in a way no one had expected. He did not stop there. He pursued Guthrum to his stronghold, besieged it for 2 weeks, and forced a surrender. The peace agreement that followed, the Treaty of Wedmore, divided England between Alfred's Wessex and a Viking-controlled zone that became known as the Danelaw. England had been split, but the Vikings had been stopped. The war for England was far from over. Something remarkable happened in the decades after Alfred's victory. The Vikings stopped being raiders and started becoming settlers, and not just in England. Across the British Isles, Viking communities took root. In Ireland, they founded the city of Dublin, which grew from a Norse trading camp into one of the most important ports in the North Atlantic. In northern Scotland and the islands offshore, Norse culture so dominated that traces of it survive in place names and dialect to this day. In the Danelaw, the Viking-governed half of England, Norse farmers plowed fields that had once belonged to English families. Norse law courts operated alongside English ones. Norse and English began blending into each other, a cultural mixing that left permanent marks in the English language. Hundreds of everyday English words, sky, egg, knife, husband, window, anger, came directly from Old Norse. The men who had come to destroy were staying to build. They were establishing markets, minting coins, forging political alliances, and in many cases converting to Christianity to smooth relations with their neighbors. The brutal raiders of Lindisfarne were becoming the landlords, merchants, and rulers of a transformed northern world. The Vikings were changing, and so was Europe. Nowhere was that transformation more dramatic than on the rivers of Francia, where a Viking army was sailing toward the greatest prize on the continent. Paris in 885 AD was the beating heart of the Frankish kingdom. Its river island location on the Seine made it wealthy and strategically vital. Whoever controlled Paris controlled the main route into the interior of Francia. The Vikings knew this perfectly. In November of 885, a fleet of roughly 700 ships and perhaps 40,000 men arrived at the bridges of Paris under a leader named Siegfried and demanded payment to pass. The Frankish defenders, led by a determined count named Odo, refused. What followed was a siege that lasted nearly a year. The Vikings attacked the bridges and the city walls repeatedly, using siege towers, catapults, and fire ships. The defenders fought back with desperate courage, pouring boiling oil, throwing stones, and making sorties to destroy enemy siege equipment. The city held. Month after month, Paris endured. The Frankish king, Charles the Fat, eventually arrived with an army, and then, in what his people never forgave him for, paid the Vikings to leave rather than fight them. The silver bought a retreat, but it also exposed a truth that changed everything. The Frankish central power was weakening. Local lords, men like Odo, were the real defenders of their people. The kings were failing, and one Viking leader, watching how power actually worked in Francia, was about to receive a kingdom. His name was Rollo, a Norse chieftain of disputed origin, Norwegian, some say, Danish, according to others. He had raided the Frankish coast for years with an effectiveness that made him impossible to ignore. When the Frankish king Charles the Simple decided that fighting Rollo endlessly was less practical than making him a defender of the very territory he kept attacking, he offered a deal. In 911 AD, by the Treaty of Saint Clair-sur-Epte, Rollo received a substantial grant of land at the mouth of the Seine River. In exchange, he pledged loyalty to the Frankish crown, agreed to defend the region against further Viking raids, and accepted Christian baptism. The land he received was called Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo embraced his new role with the same intensity he had brought to raiding. He built, he governed, he protected. His descendants adopted the French language, the Christian faith, and the political culture of the Frankish world around them. Within a few generations, they were less Viking than they were French. But they carried Norse ambition, Norse military brilliance, and Norse hunger for conquest deep in their blood. Rollo's great-great-great-grandson would eventually command an invasion of England that would change that country permanently. His descendants would change history forever. While Vikings fought for control of England and Francia, others were sailing in a completely different direction, away from crowded coastlines and into the open Atlantic, looking not for kingdoms to conquer, but for empty land to fill. Iceland had been visited briefly by Irish monks before the Norse arrived. But from around 870 AD, Viking settlers came in serious numbers. They were pushed by a combination of factors: land shortage in Norway, the violence and instability of the Viking world, the appeal of a place where land was genuinely free for the taking. What they found was extraordinary and terrifying in equal measure. Iceland was geologically alive. Volcanoes erupted, geysers shot boiling water from the earth, lava fields stretched to the horizon. But between the fire and ice were long valleys of rich grass, rivers thick with salmon, and coastal waters full of fish and seabirds. Within 60 years, nearly every usable piece of land in Iceland had been claimed. The settlers built farms, raised cattle and sheep, and created a remarkable political institution, the Althing, established in 930 AD, one of the world's first parliamentary assemblies, where free men gathered annually to make laws and settle disputes. Iceland became a Norse civilization in miniature, isolated but functioning, proud and independent. But beyond Iceland's western shores lay an even greater mystery. Erik Thorvaldsson had a problem. He had killed a man, in fact he had killed several men, in the kinds of feuds that flared constantly in Iceland's rough frontier society. The Althing sentenced him to exile for 3 years. Erik, who history would remember as Erik the Red for his fiery hair and fiercer temper, took his exile not as punishment, but as opportunity. Around 982 AD, he sailed west from Iceland into waters that other Norse sailors had glimpsed but never seriously explored. What he found was a massive island, the largest island on Earth, covered mostly in ice, but with western and southwestern coastlines where fjords opened into green valleys rich with grass and game. Erik spent his 3 years of exile exploring thoroughly, mapping the coastlines, assessing the land. When his sentence ended, he returned to Iceland with a plan. He called the new land Greenland, a deliberate marketing decision, he reportedly admitted, because a pleasant name would attract settlers. It worked. In 985 AD, 25 ships left Iceland loaded with settlers, livestock, tools, and ambition. 14 ships survived the crossing. It was enough. 2 Norse colonies took root on Greenland's western coast and endured for centuries. Erik had added another piece to the Norse world, but his son would sail even farther. Leif Erikson grew up on Greenland's frontier, raised in the tradition of men who went toward the unknown rather than away from it. Around the year 1000 AD, he sailed west from Greenland into waters no European had ever intentionally crossed. What he found, called Vinland in the Norse sagas for the wild grapes or berries his crew discovered there, was the coast of North America. Exactly where he landed remains debated by historians, but archaeological evidence discovered in the 1960s at Lonsau Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, proved conclusively that Norse people built a settlement on North American soil 5 centuries before Columbus. They found timber in abundance, something desperately scarce in Greenland. They found rich land, clean rivers, and a climate warmer than home. They also found people, the indigenous inhabitants they called Skrælings, and the encounters between them were tense and eventually violent. The Norse attempts to establish a permanent settlement in Vinland failed within a few years, driven off by conflict, with a population too large and too determined to displace. But the fact of what they had achieved was extraordinary. The Vikings had reached lands no European should have known existed, and had done it not with the resources of a great empire, but with a handful of ships and the Norse refusal to accept any horizon as final. Back in the north, the Viking world was growing into something more recognizable as civilization. The kingdoms of Scandinavia were consolidating. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, powerful rulers were absorbing smaller chieftains and tribes into larger, more stable political structures. Trade networks that had begun with raiding now functioned through established markets. Viking merchants traveled river routes deep into Russia, giving that country its very name, derived from the Norse word Russ, trading furs, amber, and slaves for silver from the Islamic world and silk from Byzantium. Norse settlers had transformed the political landscape from Ireland to Russia, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. Some had even served as elite bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople, the famed Varangian Guard. The age of pure raiding was fading. Something more structured, more permanent, and in its own way more impressive was replacing it. Viking descendants were ruling duchies in France, kingdoms in England, settlements across the North Atlantic. The longships were still being built, but now they carried merchants and diplomats as often as warriors. One king was about to draw all the northern threads together into something that looked, briefly, like a true Norse empire. He was Danish by birth, English by conquest, and Norse by blood, and his name would become a symbol of the Viking world at its peak. Canute the Great was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable rulers of the medieval world. Born around 995 AD, the son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, he arrived in England as a conqueror following years of brutal Danish campaigning. By 1016 AD, at barely 20 years old, he was king of England, a country his father had effectively won and he had secured through a combination of warfare and shrewd political dealing. He did not stop there. Within a decade, Canute also ruled Denmark and Norway, making him master of a North Sea empire, stretching from the Irish coast to the borders of Sweden. He governed England not as a foreign occupier, but as a legitimate English king, issuing laws, supporting the church, and maintaining the administrative structures the Anglo-Saxons had built. His famous gesture at the seashore, commanding the tide to stop and watching it ignore him, was not, as popular legend misremembers, an act of arrogance. It was a lesson to his flattering courtiers that no king, however powerful, could command nature. Even Canute understood his limits. He ruled wisely and broadly until his death in 1035 AD, and the empire he held together was a genuine achievement. But he had built it around his personal ability, not durable institutions. The empire looked unstoppable, but cracks were already forming. Canute's death in 1035 AD broke his empire almost immediately. His sons, divided in loyalty and incompetence, could not hold together what their father had built. Within a decade, the Danish-Norse Empire had dissolved. England returned to Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor. Denmark and Norway went their separate ways. But something larger was happening beneath the political surface, something that would change the Viking world more profoundly than any battle. Christianity was spreading through Scandinavia, not quickly, not easily, but persistently and ultimately completely. Norway's King Olaf, Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, had pushed conversion with a ferocity that combined genuine belief with brutal political enforcement. Denmark had been gradually Christian since Harald Bluetooth's conversion in the late 10th century. Sweden followed more slowly. And as the old gods faded, the culture they had sustained began to change. The warrior ethos, the pride in raiding, the comfort with death in battle, these did not vanish overnight. But they were being reshaped by a faith that valued different virtues: humility, mercy, service to the poor. The Norse world that had produced the Great Heathen Army and the Siege of Paris was becoming a world of churches, bishops, and Christian kings. The Vikings were losing the world that had created them. But the age was not quite finished. One man refused to let it end without a final, magnificent gesture. Harald Sigurdsson, called Harald Hardrada, meaning Harald the Hard Ruler, was perhaps the last figure who embodied the original Viking spirit completely and without apology. His life read like a saga invented specifically to define what a Norse warrior could be. Exiled from Norway as a teenager after a failed battle, he traveled east, joined the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, fought campaigns in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East, accumulated vast wealth and military experience, and finally returned to Norway to claim its throne in 1046 AD. He ruled Norway for 20 years with iron authority. But Harald's ambition was never satisfied by one kingdom. When the English throne became contested in 1066 AD, the same fateful year that would end one era of English history and begin another, Harald saw his opening. He had a claim to England, or believed he did. He gathered a vast invasion fleet, allied himself with an English earl named Tostig, and sailed south. It was a plan of enormous confidence. Harold Hardrada believed, with every particle of his extraordinary experience, that he could win England. His final gamble would decide the fate of an era. The English army under King Harold Godwinson had been waiting on the southern coast for a different invasion. The Norman forces of William, Duke of Normandy, also claiming the English throne. Then news arrived. Harold Hardrada had landed in the north with a Norwegian army. Harold Godwinson marched his forces north at extraordinary speed, covering nearly 200 miles in 4 days. He caught the Norse army by surprise at Stamford Bridge, near York, on September 25, 1066 AD. The battle that followed was fierce, bloody, and decisive. Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking conqueror, a man who had fought on 3 continents and never been defeated in open battle, was killed by an arrow to the throat. His army collapsed around him. The invasion was shattered. The Vikings who had sailed from Norway with Harold filled 300 ships on the way over. The survivors needed fewer than 20 to carry them home. It was the end of something. The age that had begun with dragon ships at Lindisfarne was closing on a battlefield in northern England, its last great champion fallen in the mud of the River Derwent. 3 days later, Harold Godwinson received news that William of Normandy, himself the descendant of Norse settlers, had landed in the south. The Viking Age was ending, but its legacy was only beginning. The longships rotted, the gods fell silent. The world the Vikings had shaped by raid and settlement and exploration moved on and remembered them in fragments. In the days of the week named for Norse deities, in the words woven into the English language, in the DNA of millions of people from Iceland to Normandy to the British Isles. But the legacy ran deeper than words and genes. The Vikings had changed the map of the world in ways that outlasted every individual conquest. The Duchy of Normandy they founded produced William the Conqueror, who transformed England into a new kind of kingdom in 1066, and whose influence shaped the English-speaking world. The trade routes Norse merchants opened through Russia connected the Islamic world to northern Europe and kept commerce alive through centuries of political chaos. The settlement of Iceland preserved Norse literature and sagas that would otherwise have been lost, stories of gods and heroes that still captivate readers today. And Leif Erikson's Vinland was the first chapter in a story of transatlantic connection that would eventually reshape the entire world. The Vikings had not just raided, they had explored, settled, governed, traded, and transformed every shore they touched. Their longships are gone. Their runic inscriptions weather slowly into stone. Their gods no longer receive sacrifice. Yet more than 1,000 years later, the world still remembers them, not as raiders, but as legends.